Heather, do you have any data that's just alcohol wash and not, combined with your brood work and looking at the adult bee population, which also used alcohol wash?
Sure. So, and this expands this out a little bit too, because our experiment covered more than just Formic Pro versus not Formic Pro. We actually had some other treatment groups in there as well, because we were really looking at what happens with the viruses under different treatment regimes. So we wanted to have a number of them.
So when you talked about Formic Pro, you were referring to the full two-strip dose, single application.
Single application, 2 strips.
So also on the label is what we call the 1+1 treatment, where you treat one strip, 10 days later come in and replace the second strip. You don't have to remove the strips after treatment, except in the 1+1 when you put the second strip on. And then once that strip is spent, you don't have to go in and remove it until the next time you want to manipulate the frames. So our treatment, when we're coming back to an IPM program that works for the commercial beekeeper, you're able to leave the spent strips in until the next time you're opening the brood chamber area. So it really saves money, because for a lot of products you have to invest in going in and removing the strips at the end of their treatment period. You can't leave them in. But with the Formic Pro, once it's a spent strip, you can just leave it in until you're in the colony for other reasons. So looking at alcohol wash, what does your data show you?
So in 2024, again, we did our first assessments in May before we applied any treatments. Now we have 4 treatment groups in this experiment. There's an untreated control, and once again, we opened up the colonies the same way that we did for all the treatment groups. And I think that's really important to understand that, because every time you open the colony, you risk damaging the queen. So regardless of what the reason was for that, if it was a treatment or not. So we've equalized that risk across those groups. So we've got an untreated control. We have the Formic Pro 2-strip single application, which is what I consider to be the standard method, and that's the one that I use. But we also have this 1+1 method, which we also applied starting the same day. And then finally, we have an oxalic acid vapor method, which was what we consider to be a positive control. That's something else that's used as a varroicide, that's an effective varroicide that we run to see what how it performs against our focal treatment, Formic Pro. And what we were doing specifically with the oxalic acid was 2 grams vaporized in the front entrance of the colony, and that was spaced out by 4 days in this example.
How many treatments with oxalic acid?
That was 3 of them, yes.
3 treatments?
Yes, and we started the same day that we applied all the other treatments. So May 16th is when all those started. Right. Now, if we look at our sampling point in June, which was after the end of the 2-strip treatment period, so that would have been 21 days after the application, so 21 days after May 16th, so early June, we can see that the alcohol wash numbers for both of the Formic Pro groups have effectively gone to 0. So they started off pretty low, but they have really reduced even further as far as you can. Whereas the oxalic acid group and the control group both have started to increase a bit. Now, it's not really that surprising. We know that oxalic acid isn't a great treatment when there's brood in the colony, and by May 16th, there was brood in the colony. So that's not really a surprising result. However, we did see mite drop with that. So if you look at the sticky board data, there's quite a lot of mites dropping even in the oxalic acid group. So we know that we're killing mites, but they're only in the oxalic acid, it's going to only be the dispersal phase, so in the adult population, so it's not getting in the brood.
What we used to call the phoretic phase.
Exactly, yeah. Right. Into July, we see that those numbers are still quite low for the Formic groups, and once again, the oxalic and no treatment control groups are starting to increase further. Into August, now this is kind of an interesting one, we see that the 2 strips of Formic Pro still fairly low. In fact, it's not really different from what it looked like in July. But that 1+1 application has started to ramp up a bit.
That's reflective of we can't penetrate the cap as well with the 1+1 treatment. So we're not getting the level of kill under the cap of the Varroa population that we do with the 2-strip application.
Yeah, and it makes sense. It's a higher dosage that we're applying with the 2-strip application at one time. So. But it is still penetrating somewhat, which is really the difference between the 1-strip and the oxalic acid group here.
Right, back in July.
Only just targeting the dispersal phase. So into August, 2 strips remaining low, But by September, and I said that during this experiment, I felt that our treatment was maybe a little bit later than it should have been, but all of these groups have now fairly high levels in the adult. And some of that has to do with the fact that there's no drone brood in there anymore. So basically all of the mites have gone to the worker brood and the adult worker population. Then we hit them with 2 strips of Formic Pro. So all 4 of these groups got 2 strips of Formic Pro, and it took these levels right back down to right around where we would expect them to be going into winter.
Right. So those colonies, they'll be able to produce healthy brood cycles and have healthy bees. The other thing that's happening in October is there's always risk of reinfestation because neighbor colonies, either wild ones or managed ones that weren't treated for Varroa, become points of reinfestation. But those reinfestation Varroa haven't been part of the brood rearing within the colony. So even though you might see them, they're not going to cause any negative effect going into the winter. You'll kill those Varroa off in the spring with your early spring treatments, the ones that have made it through to that point. So these colonies, to me, they look very good, very viable for come October, because as of November 1st, all of those summer bees have disappeared, and what's left is going to be the bees going into winter, the fat bees, as we like to call them, that have the fat bodies in them to help the colony survive until the next season.
That's an interesting point that you make about the reinvasion too, because you're right. If there's a lot of reinvasion happening in October and you take an alcohol wash and you see that your numbers are higher than you think that they should be, you know, if that is due to reinvasion, they're very likely not really affecting the production of the winter bees, because a lot of that has happened at that point. So they're not going into the brood.
Yeah.
So even though you've taken an alcohol wash and your numbers maybe look scarier than you think that they should, maybe it doesn't have as much impact as what you think that it might. So this is the drone brood infestation slide. So this is now a detailed look at those different treatment groups and what the drone brood infestation looked like. We start out the year in May with a fairly high infestation rate already, up to 20% in most of these groups. And these are statistically equivalent, so there's, even though that gray bar looks like it's shorter, it's actually at the same mathematical level as these other ones, and that's the control group. So 20% of these cells are already infested in early May before we do a treatment. So that's 2 in 10 or 1 in 5. That's a decent load. But then we apply our treatments, as I went through before. The 2 Formic Pro treatment groups really go down. So this is inside the cells, what's happening inside the cells, and we see that there is a huge drop in the level of infestation there. Control and oxalic groups actually remain, the oxalic group actually went down a little bit, but the control group has remained the same. But starting into July, you really start to see that difference. Right. The 1+1 group, as we might expect, coming up a little bit because it isn't penetrating the cap as well. Oxalic acid and control groups are really ramping up.
Right. The other thing that impacts these numbers is simply the amount of drone brood that's present. So if you're looking at a percentage, if you're talking, say, a colony that has, 2,000 cells of drone brood, and then a month later it's got 4,000 cells, when you start looking at percentages, it impacts the numbers. So it's actually even better than it looks on this slide as far as the impact of Formic Pro, because simply the amount of drone brood is peaking coming through June and heading into July. So.
Absolutely. This is a very complicated data set, and I've actually analyzed it in several different ways. And one of the ways that I analyzed it, although it's not depicted here, is what you're saying. So accounting for the level of drone brood. In fact, I've done things where I've calculated the total Varroa load in the entire colony across all the populations, and it's very interesting. But the story is very similar to what we see here.
So your work is part of an ever-expanding knowledge base around Varroa mites and around bees themselves. And so we take that expanding knowledge and then apply it. And we can come out with a simple IPM program, as opposed to what we a lot of times see, almost a panic within the industry, where they simply start putting everything into the hives. They just layer treatments or combine treatments, and they just have a fingers crossed for an outcome. And if they do have a positive outcome, then of course it's because of all the work they did. And if they have a negative outcome, or we've even seen circumstances where some honey has been rejected due to pesticides that beekeepers have put in the hives, we want to stay away from that. We want to keep the image of our product as pure and healthy as possible. And so that's one of the things that Formic Pro brings to the marketplace. Simple to apply, easy to use, and effective, and keeps the image of our honey pure.
And then never mind the economic fact. If you're buying all of these products and putting all these products, that's costing you time, that's costing you a lot of money to do that. And maybe it's really not necessary.
Yeah. And you can do other things with your time to advance your bottom line. If you're spending your time running around gassing your bees constantly, then that's not helping.
Yeah, there are other ways.
Yes.
Okay, so the final brood infestation slide that I want to show you is the worker brood infestation. So here we really see the picture. Once again, we have our Formic Pro applied here. Worker brood tends to be far less infested. Like I said, this is the non-preferred host of Varroa. So Varroa really want to be in drones and drone brood. So the numbers start off very low. And in fact, at the beginning of the year, if we find one infested cell in 100 that we open, that's lucky. So it's hard to actually detect them after treatment application. You can even see here, though, there's like a little bit of a dip. So even though it was very low to start out with, like less, this is probably around 2% infestation rate on average. It goes down to essentially 0. And then into July, it's still quite low for the Formic Pro groups. We see the same thing in August that we saw before, which is that the 1+1 group starts to come up, but the 2-strip group is still quite low. Coming up in these other two, the untreated and the oxalic acid groups. And here we're starting to see the shift, because remember I said that in 2024, the last month that we saw drone brood was August, so they're actually starting to ramp down drone production this year. That's not true of every year, but it was in 2024. So you're really starting to see the shift, because you're starting to see these numbers come up here. And then in September, really the full load of Varroa that needs to be under a capped cell is now in the worker brood, because there just aren't any drones available. And then we hit them with 2 strips of Formic Pro, and it went down to essentially 0 again.
Yeah, within the brood. So that's our healthy brood that'll make up our winter cluster.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, very important.
And 2024 also was a warm enough and long enough year that we were still finding substantial amounts of worker brood even into October of that year. Yeah. So this is not reflective of just there wasn't any worker brood left. There's still quite a decent amount of worker brood in October.
Hello beekeepers. Is your Varroa IPM working for you? We have created a 5-part series to help beekeepers answer that question. In this 5-part series, we'll be discussing the following topics: threshold versus goal-driven IPM, protecting populations, where are your Varroa and viruses, and the focus on fall treatments. See you there. Thanks for watching another episode of Behind the Hive. Please feel free to add your questions or concerns in the comment section. Give us a like if you're enjoying these videos, and we look forward to being with you again in the future.